The paper that myself and Prof. Van Heerden, I see he's here, and Prof. Heinrich Bolman, I don't see him online currently, but he'll probably join. He also said that he's stuck in load shedding, so I hope he can join us a bit later as well. The research that I'll be presenting today is based on that, which I did for my thesis, which is an interesting topic. It was published now by ERSA on their website. You can go and read the whole paper there. I think it's a, well, I'm actually glad for ERSA that we can upload the whole document. Always for the working paper, it's nice uploading the working paper because you can go into a lot more detail. So I can't go into all that detail. So I'm thankful for the upload. You can go and read it there. There's a lot more in terms of the impact on regions in South Africa, the impact on different household types throughout South Africa. What I'll be trying to do today is just give you an overview of exactly what we try to do to simulate in our model. And some of the, because it's a macroeconomic shock, I'll just quickly go into some of the macroeconomic results and then briefly touch on some of the more important results that we found on a household level as well. Which I thought was quite interesting. I did build a quick presentation. Well, it's always boring. I try sometimes to add pictures at least, but this time I couldn't even get to that, being interrupted now and having to drive all this way. So let me see if I can present my screen or share with me my screen. I should have privileges. There we go. It's working. Should be showing on your side now. Yes, it's saying it's showing. If it's not showing, just stop me once again. So yes, the title is maybe a bit bold, if you want to state it in that way. A fiscus for better economic and social development in South Africa. So that was my question. I started working for Dawie Rood, a well-known economist in South Africa, about 7 years ago. And one of the first things he told me is that the current fiscal policy isn't working. And that's actually where the question arose from: what can we do to make it better? And are we on the right trajectory in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of what we spend on and how much we spend on it? What are the results of that spending? And then is there something better that can be done to increase better sustainable levels of economic output that can actually lead to job creation? And I think what I'll show now and what our research showed is that government has it lopsided. They have the tail end of the story. And which isn't leading to sustainable levels of GDP and jobs with that. So before I get into it, I don't know how you usually handle your presentations, but yeah, I'll keep an eye out on the chat box. If you want to ask a question, I usually do it a bit more interactive, but I know you said mute the mics, but if someone wants to ask a question, I think maybe just jump in. I wouldn't have all the answers. That's why I'm glad Professor Prof. Van Heerden is also here. He does have all the answers, so we'll just give him the difficult ones. Starting ourselves off, this is basically, as I said, where the story began for me. This question between wealth redistribution and wealth creation. What we saw from 1994 to 95 budget periods, these are specific budget periods, to 2007-8, really this neoliberalist type of pro-market, business-friendly sort of environment where the government privatized, that curse word which they have now, and we brought debt levels down, deficits, 2 years of budget surplus, which is something that we don't see very often now. And the big thing here is social development, spending on social development, which we define as spending on wages, the government wage bill, and then social assistance in the form of various grants. That was about 55% initially, and it came down to 48%. And this is the bulk of government spending. So, and as you can see, that clear decrease in that. Unfortunately, though, it was this very low spending on investments. Now, investments we define as tangible and non-tangible assets. That's your infrastructure projects. That's what's done with construction in our country. It's important to know that when we talk about investments, it's not just government investment. It's not just government infrastructure projects. This is all tangible and non-tangible assets. I think that's a better idea to see it. So that was only, in terms of government budget allocation, only 5.3% for this period. During this period, critics believe, I'm going to keep an eye on the clock, not to waste too much of your time. Critics, not enough was done in terms of social development. So really going at this reduction of 55 to 48%, and then not enough was spent on investments. And I think that was the crucial part, and some of the the main protagonists there, Federke and Stats, Professor Duplessis and Smith down there in Cape Town. So after the global financial crisis, what we saw happen here is specifically from 2008-09, 2017, as most countries do, they start spending more. The problem is we just never stopped spending more. And specifically, we didn't spend on these wealth creative policies that I referred to earlier. So spending on social development as a percentage of total expenditure increased from 48 to 52%. And interesting here is that South Africa had the greatest reduction in poverty and income inequality, which was later proven. And in spite of that, we still have some of the highest income inequality in the world, or probably the highest still. Spending on investments came down, which is not good. And the research here, once again, just alluding to the previous authors in the research that they showed, is this reduction in investments, which we call it, or they call capital expenditure, or a broader term of infrastructure, etc. Because that deteriorated over actually a very long term. It's not comparable to other African or other emerging market countries. They linked that, and they showed actually causality between this reduction and the reduction in GDP. This reduction in the productive capacity, which is important for our modeling as well, this reduction in productive capacity in South Africa, which led by cause and effect towards these lower levels of GDP. Of course, not the only reason, but a contributing reason. Debt soared during this time, most unequal. And the conclusion that we got, that we reached throughout our literature review was that a new fiscal policy alternative is needed. And I'm going to get into that right now. So before we could get to that, we first tried to understand government's current policy. So government's current policy is based on Keynesian economics, where we all know you increase government spending and you increase income. And that doesn't hold in South Africa's case, and the literature is actually quite dense on this and quite clear on this. Or initially not clear, but now in more later years we're actually quite clear on this. And it's more that we see Wagner's law holding in South Africa, where you first grow the economy, and as a result of that, government then grows or starts spending more. So just going to summarize here briefly a simple explanation for the mixed results that was initially got between these different authors, Ansari et al., Zarambi and Alvin Baya, between whether Wagner's law hold or Keynes' approach holds, can be ascribed to the fact that the bulk of government spending is unproductive. And of course, if government spending is unproductive, more spending wouldn't necessarily increase more income. So that's where this research took us further then, and specifically on the productive side of productive spending. Of government, we split government spending into the functional classification, and then here, before I get to the functional classification, the economic classification. And there you can break government expenditure up into social development, which is about, over the entire period, and 44%, on final goods and services about 23%, and interest is about 9%. And as we know, as I showed earlier, the smallest portion, of course, goes to investments in terms of an economic classification. And investment really is this portion of government spending that can actually lead to long-term total factor productivity. And that's what we need if we want to grow the economy sustainably in the long term. The other expenditure items, specifically on social development, which we refer to as the wage bill, and then of course not just the wage bill but also grants, do not increase total factor productivity in the long term. Grants do help in the short term to increase consumption, but it's really that giving the guy the fish instead of teaching him how to fish. And then to the same extent, the wage bill of government, we did a lot of work to, it is the largest expenditure item now, considerably larger even in this year in the COVID budget, that we try to understand first, is government spending unproductive? And we found, compared to other countries, this is the case. We expressed government, the wage bill, in terms of output, GDP output. The idea here is that how many civil servants do you need to facilitate economic activity? And then on the other end, we also expressed the wage bill in terms of total expenditure. Once again, the amount of workers that you need to effectively create output. In government's case, this would be government spending. And on that basis, we found that government employees in South Africa are the third most unproductive, but the third highest paid. We looked at about, I think it was 15 countries across the world and compared these, what we call productivity levels of government. So concluding here, well, just before I conclude, maybe also just the functional classification. Once again, the 43% is spent on education, healthcare, and interest. And we know we have some of the worst educational results in the world. So that's just one study, Timms and Pills, is the one that I really like. They show that maths second lowest, science lowest, literacy lowest in the world. That's including Zimbabwe and a couple of other poor performing countries. I think Venezuela is even on the list. And then poorest healthcare results also in the world. So we do spend a large portion, we're just not seeing the results. And also, if you compare our total spending on these items, not a total spending, as a percentage of GDP, ours is very high. It's usually in the top 5 to 7 in the world, but our results, once again, the lowest in the world. So this is just another way to show that in addition to the literature that takes another approach, government expenditure is quite unproductive. I'm going to try and speed up now. If we can assume that government expenditure is unproductive, then more government expenditure would not lead to a larger economy and to more jobs. That's the bottom line. So what we need to do is grow the economy somehow, and that's what Inchaste and some of the other authors also found. Stan, Professor Du Plessis, and Steyn found the same. Federke et al. Also found the same. Mabubu et al. Also found the same. So building on that literature to say that how do we grow this economy? Just before I touch on the model, our fiscal policy alternative would suggest reducing government's wage bill. Well, not reducing it, just keeping it inflationary or fixed in real terms over a 5-year period. And then we use the savings generated from that to subsidize the construction industry. We specifically chose the construction industry because the construction industry is a good proxy for investments. So we want to get to this point where we increase investments. Now, in the paper, we go into a lot more detail on why specifically construction industry and why it's a good proxy and all that, but you're just going to have to take my word for it now. And then to facilitate this policy alternative, to see if this better policy alternative of reducing or keeping wage bill fixed, using the savings only for 5 years, using those savings to boost investments indirectly through the subsidy in the construction industry, whether or not that could lead to a potentially better economy, a more sustainable growing economy, and then of course more jobs, we developed the what we call Term SA, the enormous regional model for South Africa. It's based on the original model from Urani, and then later the term model developed by Horridge et al. In 2005. It basically consists of linearized system of theoretical equations, as you see there. You could go and read Dixon and Rimmer, they go into all the details about that. In addition to this model, we also included dynamics, where you get year-on-year results or year-on-year simulations from capital accumulation. We have a lagged wage adjustment, sticky wages, all those cool things, and then also government. And interesting though, in this case, I also added foreign debt accumulation, which is very important in South Africa's case. Even though only 10% of a GDP, 10% of the debt is foreign debt, it plays an important role, as we'll see later. And then, which I later also thought about joining us, or not just me, we have thought about joining is SAM modeling, which I'll quickly show here, which is really interesting, and it gives a lot more depth to the type of regional dynamic models of the past. There are a couple of other examples. There was one ID Gem, Effect Gem, and a couple of others. We just added some more dynamics to that. This is the SAM for South Africa, the 2012 SAM updated to 2015 figures. You can, I'm assuming most of you know how a social accounting matrix works. The interesting thing here, I'm going to move my mouse and see, and hopefully you can follow me. Basically, we should say here all the income levels households have, all the income households derive, And then if you follow the columns, everything households pay. So households buy domestic commodities, households buy imported commodities, households pay taxes, and not just commodity taxes, other taxes as well. We just call it commodity taxes here. Here's the direct taxes, personal income taxes. They transfer money to enterprises, very important. So Van Seventer did a lot of work in 2017 to facilitate or use statistics of SA data to build out this social accounting matrix. We adopted some of that with the Stats SA data to get to this level of detail. Now, all the dark gray shaded blocks, this is what Sam adds to the original Urani term type models, which aren't highlighted in gray. So you can see a lot more detail here, specifically here on capital, the gross operating surplus that goes to households, that goes to enterprises. You can see the bulk then, of course, and then some of it that goes to government, which is quite crucial. And then here also taxes. What we decided to add, I think I have it on the next slide. No, not really. We usually in CGE type models, you would have one household. And in rich countries, it's not too impossible to believe that this is possible, because the average household is a good representation of that economy. South Africa, we know that's not the case. So we split households into 12 household types. The poorest and richest household types were split into into ventiles. So a lot more detail, which I'll go into a bit later. Also, what we did, which we added to the original Urani type database or national database, and in this term, the regional database, is really to split government sector into government general services, government education, and government healthcare, so that we could split our private healthcare and, of course, private education as well. And this also gave us very interesting results. Here is the households that, there's the slide on households that I was referring to. And here you can see the household type. So that's poorest 5% to richest 5%. Poorest 5%, 0 to 5, 5 to 10, and then 10 to 20, 20 to 30, etc. And where they get their income from. Labor income, gross operating surplus, this is a percentage, and from government, they then pay taxes, income taxes. They also transfer to government and to enterprises, and they also receive transfers from the rest of the world. This should be government. Sorry, I see. That should be transfers to and from. Okay. Interesting here, which I'll go into later as well, is that the gross operating surplus, the largest portion here goes to the richer households. This we of course know. And then on the government transfers from government, you'll see the bulk of the transfers here go to the poorest households, the poorest 5%. Some of it does still go to rich households as well. It's not just grants, that's important to understand. What we modeled here is in a similar way where we split capital in terms of the interest that's earned on it, the gross operating surplus. We also split government debt, which is owned by the foreigners and locally by households and enterprises. That debt is held more so by richer households than poorest households. So this 4.3% is not that the rich households are receiving a grant, they are receiving another transfer from government, and that's that interest payment on the debt that they own. So the results, and I know that's what you've been waiting for, and I see we have at least another half an hour. I doubt I'll use all of that. So yes, as I said, please go and read the paper. If you want to go into a lot more detail. Here I just focus on the aggregates because this is a macroeconomic shock. It's not a regional shock, or a regional meaning provincial specific shock. And what we did here, as I tried to explain, we kept the real government wage bill fixed for 5 years. So it's inflationary adjustment, which it's always supposed to be, but they always get something more. We looked at that from 1994 to 2017-18, the average wage bill increase was 11.7%. Average inflation was about, I think, 6.5 or 6.8, or I'm sitting under correction now. So it's quite high. So we keep that fixed for 5 years, the real wage bill at this 6.8% level, if you want to see it in that extent. And then we use that to increase investments via a subsidy or through a subsidy in the construction industry. And here you can see just over that 5 year period, it's about a saving, or for the construction industry, a tax saving of 6.3 billion. It's a very small portion of government's total income. And on the left-hand side, some of the initial macro results here from the income side. The next one will show you from the expenditure side. Just quickly showing you there how it looks. This is from the income side. You can see here capital, of course, increasing as investment increases, capital increases in the next period by the largest portion here, about 8%. And then you can also see GDP increasing here almost 6% over the investment period. Just in general, I wouldn't. This wasn't an aggressive policy. I think this is a policy that can actually be implemented. I don't think we can go to government, well, maybe now, where we are now, because the government is really making a lot of noise in terms of reducing the wage bill and getting rid of some of the early retirees, etc. So they really want to that's not right, reduce the wage bill. Let's keep it at that. Reduce the wage bill. But this is an easy policy just to say, don't reduce, don't lay people off, don't get rid of people, just keep it fixed for 5 years. And even there we saw that in the long term it can lead to, solid gains, 6%, but on the employment side, we see that it leads to about 460,000 additional employees. So it doesn't sound like a lot. Remember, it was a 5-year period shock. It wasn't an aggressive shock. We didn't reduce, we didn't cut, we didn't harm anyone. So I think there's a lot of value in this, considering that if we extend that from a 5-year to a 10-year period, or what happened if for the last 12 years over that period where we saw really the social systems increasing, what if over that entire period the wage will only increase by inflation? What would the results then have been? Then we would have probably reached, what was it, President Zuma, I think, initially, that said the government wants to increase the amount of employees or jobs in the government sector by 1 million by this period. We would have reached that had they kept the wage bill and used that as a saving, as a subsidy for investment. But then, of course, jobs wouldn't be in the government, jobs would have been in other industries, throughout the economy. Just there also something interesting that we just added here, the two forms of labor. So this is capital labor, and then the net effect of that GDP. Labor there in terms of the wage bill increasing a little less than labor in terms of employment. About, I think it's on the next slide, 2.5%, but I like showing a graph at least. There it is, 456 jobs. So the reason why the employment percentage is slightly higher than the wage bill percentage, because these industries, these investment related industries that got the bulk of the boost through the construction sector subsidy, or the construction sector itself, of course, the electrical sector, and then glass and non-metals. And these industries have cheaper semi-skilled workers. So that they could, of course, employ a bit more. That's why the 2.4% is a bit higher than the 1.45%. Then the results on the expenditure side, here everything is more or less around the same level. I hope you can see my mouse here just there. The big purple one is, of course, investments, and that's what we clearly saw, this great big increase. Yeah, that's what we wanted to shock, and that's what we saw. And then here, the little blue line, that's GDP, and everything more or less around GDP. I'm quickly going to touch on why government expenditure, this was an assumption that we made. This is the government user now. An important differentiator in CGE type models is that we have both a government user and a government industries. So this is the government user, and the government user uses services from the government industries. The government industries, as I said, was general government services, which we split, government education and government healthcare. So we assume the government user would not deviate his spending from the baseline. All of these measures, sorry, I should have said that earlier. Prof, you should have interrupted me, but these are percentage deviations away from the baseline. So we assume that government spending would remain on the baseline, and we also assume that the deficit would remain on the baseline. Later we can play around with that, but our policy model was specifically to see that if we keep all things equal in government, and we simply reduce the wage bill and use that, what would the impact be? So that's why that one is fixed, and I'll quickly go into why households here an initial slump. But you can understand that we were keeping wage bill fixed, labor income fixed, for that matter. That's what we saw over the year as well. Labor income initially decreasing in that 5-year period and then slowly increasing. And that's why we saw this household decrease over the year before we saw this gradual increase over the year. I think that about sums it up. I'm not going to go into the terms of trade, but that does explain why exports here just slightly above GDP. I'm going to show you that light blue line over there. Exports just slightly above. So as the economy grows, because of this shock that we put it in, investments growing, economy grows, and then exports grows with that. A local cost decrease, we know, because wages were kept fixed or relative to the baseline, there was a reduction. So lower costs, of course, means lower input costs for commodities, and then local prices relative to global prices are then a bit cheaper, and that leads to a deteriorating in terms of trade, and that boosts exports over the investment period. Then household consumption, I did go into that. Just interesting here that I might just briefly touch on aggregate prices. Real GDP was 5.9% higher, as we saw, almost 6%, but the GDP deflator was down by about 5.1%. GDP deflator almost here similar to inflation levels or household prices. So aggregate prices remain under pressure, as I said, lower wages initially, and from there, although wages of course start to increase and we return to equilibrium, return to these levels, they weren't able to pick up fast enough. And once again, the paper goes into more detail about this, but let's just keep it there. More productive capacity causes prices decrease relative to the baseline. So industries, to understand the industry results, it's important to understand that these results are driven by the macroeconomic shock in this case, and then of course to other specifics about the policy shocks. So more investments, more favors construction, of course, as we saw, and electrical, and because they supply 78 and 33% respectively to the industry, and then glass and non-metal. So although glass and non-metals doesn't necessarily supply a large portion to investors in the economy, they do supply to construction. So it's like an indirect effect what we saw here. They also contribute a large portion to exporters, for export use, and then they contribute 10% to themselves. So growth begets more growth. And so these are the industries that we really saw standing out and really tied to the macro story. Industries that didn't do well, of course, these would be the government industries, because that's what we assumed, that's what we fixed. We kept, as I said, the government spending and the deficit fixed, so they were really capped by their baseline. Industries who supply to households, as we saw initially here, the slump in household spending, which we saw was a result there, the slump, which was of course a slump in the income that they get from wages. That of course would then cause these industries that supply to the household sector, mostly food and beverages, 71% go to household, and textile and footwear, 64% go to household. These industries also saw a substantial decrease over the investment period. So there are, of course, winners and losers. Now, this is probably the last two slides, and then I know we're going to get to the questions. We can just see, yeah, there it is, last three slides. What I showed earlier in terms of the social accounting matrix and how we split the different household types, this is briefly going to touch on that. In addition, as I said, to viewing household income only as the labor income, we added with the SAM capabilities other sources of income. So we can now determine household savings, which is very important for other policy measures in the long term as well. So I did not add that graph. I'm sorry I forgot about that, but it is in the paper, which it shows how household savings increases over this period and how it favors richer households, which I'll get to now. So sources of income here are labor, 54%, gross operating surplus, 15%, transfers from enterprises, 19%, transfers from government, that's interest on debt, and of course grants, 11%, and transfers from the rest of the world, 0.4%. I probably could have left that out, but I like trying to keep it as accurate as possible, so I kept it in. So then, of course, if I deduct now payments to the rest of the world, taxes and transfers to government and enterprises from all the sources of income, then of course I get household savings. So labor income, just briefly here, grew by 4.5%. Gross operating surplus, the assumption here, it's driven by growth in in aggregate payments to capital and land. So because we saw this increase in capital, of course, we would naturally see an increase here in gross operating surplus as well. Transfers from enterprises grew, transfers from government, transfers from enterprises grows in line with post-tax enterprise income. So we also have a function that determines enterprise income and spending. And then transfers from government. I just want to see our grants grow in line with nominal GDP. And when I was rereading this, I realized that that might not be a very good assumption. So I can say that now, although for our policy period 2015 to 2030, I think it is an accurate assumption. I know that from 2008-09 to where we are last year, we did see a substantial increase. I see some questions. Let's see. Okay, cool. Sound. Okay, cool. Sound is fine, it seems. So grants grow in line with nominal GDP, which now, given that GDP is about 1.5%, inflation, let's say, is 4.5%, so that's quite low. I think that assumption can hold in the next period, 2015 to 2018, even though we initially saw that big increase in spending on grants from 2008-09 to about 2016, 2017 years. I think this can hold. Then just, sorry, I just wanted to explain that because I read it today and I was like, oh, maybe I made a mistake. So richer, important conclusion.
It looks like we're having some technical difficulties. We'll just give it a few minutes. Hopefully Francois will be able to get back.
Load shedding. And usually Starbucks, their reception is actually quite good. Let me just quickly open that. I think it's one of the last slides, and then we can get into the questions. Yes, it is the last slide. So all I was explaining here really is that the I can't say the bulk of the benefit. Households did benefit as well. You can see the difference in household gross income here isn't substantially higher in the case of the richest households, in the same that we saw then with savings then, because a larger portion, of course, of taxes gets paid by the richer households. So in net, although the richer households are benefited by an increase in investments, I think our conclusion was that, as I showed earlier, first grow the economy by keeping wages fixed for 5 years and increasing investments through a subsidy for the construction industry. And then after we create that wealth, can we then start redistributing it? And I think that is it from my side. Thank you for listening all this time. I hope I could keep you entertained at least somewhat.
Thank you.